And welcome to Let Them Talk. I'm Paul DiRienzo. We have a great show in store. We're going to travel to the birthplace of democracy, and what a great place to go this election year. Thank you, Giannis, for joining us. He's a thinker and a writer based in Athens.
Nice to bring me here, Paul.
Oh, glad to have you. Yeah, and we met when you were turning me on to all this very cool, like, Greek techno, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, this kind of stuff. I'm pretty much involved in some cultural, artistic, counterculture, I would say, collectives of doing this kind of stuff in Greece and generally moving around in Europe, doing, organizing big events, underground festivals, also lectures on several things on counterculture and this kind of stuff. The way of connecting different generations of people under the general idea of rethinking the way that reality, normality goes on. I mean, it's the thing, and we all the time put a nice musical surrounding under the whole concept.
Beautiful. And so you're actually based in Athens. That's where you spend most of your time doing most of your work.
Yeah. Moving around, of course, all the time, visiting people.
I see.
Traveling. I like traveling a lot, very much as well.
So you have a background in communications and radio. We were talking earlier about radio and television.
And I had been a radio producer in a daily program on one of the three major Greek radio stations back in the late 80s, early 90s. And also I am and I was pretty much involved in radio broadcasting of music and other arts and films and everything. And I was involved for a period of time on the late 90s on some Greek TV programs of the national television that had to do with music and cinema.
Okay, interesting. So that's because, of course, you put the emphasis on countercultural, and that puts you in a sort of like...
That's my thing.
Yeah, you're in a position to observe a lot of what's going on.
I wouldn't say that I'm defined of my professions. I mean, as a radio producer or as a, let's say, a music program producer, something like that, or as a writer. Mainly, I would say that I'm defined on the main case that I'm on searching of connecting different ideas, different notions of what counterculture was and how this counterculture that was back in the 60s, 70s, early 80s had been transformed in the 90s and late 90s and early zeros, and now can be somehow reconnected under new terms, new flashes of networking ideas, and bring forth a new vision, which is the thing that we need, don't we?
Yeah.
Here in the West, we need so much. I mean, a new vision, a global vision. Anyway, we travel globally, we thinking globally, we act in let's say in our places, in the places we live. We act in our regions, but in the same time, it's desperately important to think and act through our personal ways and through our regional work globally.
Okay, very interesting. So, to what extent is your work informed by events that have occurred in Greece over the last few years, with the decline, with the economic collapse that occurred all over the world, including the United States, and
I think it
had a particular effect on Greece?
It's one of the cycles that
and sort of showed the
capitalism generally is doing the cycles of production and the destruction of production after a cycle.
Right. Okay. Right. That's very interesting, and because it seems to me when they talk about Greece as a small country having problems on the periphery, but actually in many ways I think of a country like Greece as sort of it's sort of like a keystone to the whole thing, because if the Eurozone and the European community cannot, deal with one problem in one country, then what are they good for at all? I mean,
what the European community, as you're mentioning on, is really, I mean, European community is something like a co-federation, which at the moment has a very, very weak basis on let's say, institutions that are support from below the very centers of decision making. I would say it's quite bureaucratic and technocratic in the way that brings forth any kind of decisions. And in a way, the European Union somehow is one of the key images in our world's global creation of a kind of a technocratic society which is not truly run by the people themselves, but through some certain executives that take the decisions in the name of the people, instead of giving the people the opportunity to take the decisions. In the past, Europe, especially after the movements in the 60s and 70s, and also there is a long tradition of movements in Europe for, let's say, something like direct democracy and general cultural.
What do you mean by direct democracy?
Direct democracy is a democracy kind which is not just based on the idea of having representatives, but also on the idea of having assemblies on a lower level, where these assemblies are combined together and rediscuss things and take, let's say, the first decisions on a regional level and on a more wide level. Direct democracy is what was taking place somehow in many parts of the world, and especially in the place that it's been invented in Athens, Greece, back in the 5th century.
Where it was
the way that the assemblies of the people.
Or a black stone, yes or no?
Yeah, something like that, but also long talks. People were going in the center, and they were having long talk about the subject, and after everybody was discussing, taking the decisions. Of course, it could not be easy to have a consensus, which would be even more, let's say, close to how my idea of getting a political decision is important. But if you have tens or 100,000 people, tens of thousands of people, 100,000 people, it's very difficult to get, a decision under a consensus. Takes much more long time. Takes much longer. So these people were just voting after a long discussion.
I see.
And Cornelios Castoriadis used very much one of the Greek, but he worked very much in France for quite a long time. He was a radical thinker in many aspects of philosophy and political theory. His ideas were very radicalizing that let's say, notion of political theory and philosophy. Adapted that model that is being used to former types of political organization and political structures, like in ancient Athens, and used it as a mean to think and rethink of the way that social movements in the world now can organize themselves and take the decisions.
I see.
An alternative model, let's say, that it's being combined on the idea of having also representatives in an upper level.
How's that been playing out?
There's an interaction between the assemblies and the representatives in direct democracy. There is always an interaction, and the basic core of the decision is being taken by the assemblies on the basis by the people.
Is that what's going on today? Is that happening at a certain level?
Actually, there was a very huge movement that is being that had been based on this kind very of accurate ideas of what direct democracy is, and this movement was sharing actions in what was called in 2010-2011 the Arab Spring uprisings, and also in Indignados in Spain, in Aganaktismenus in Greek, in Syntagma Square, where all the decisions were getting had been made by this kind of political model. And also, I think, affected very much what happened in the U.S. by the Occupy and the other movements.
So it really began in Athens with the reaction to the decline that happened there and spread, in a way, to...
More or less.
Egypt, to Tunisia, to the United States.
Yeah, but look, this... not exactly on the way you're describing it, since there was a big uprising in Athens in 2008. Why? Because a young kid had been assassinated by a police officer. So there was a huge uprising of the people, and there was a lot of rage in those days and all that stuff. So many people came forth and said, why not to organize some political assemblies that somehow will take decisions on several matters instead of just sitting and having all these big demonstrations about the assassinations and everything. So somehow some first assemblies had been created in many places all over Greece in those days, in 2008, late 2008 and early 2009. These were assemblies of people who were staying and living in neighborhoods, in certain neighborhoods, and were taking actions that were evolving the life of their neighborhoods. For example, in Athens, where I'm living, there's not so much green. There are not so many parks. I mean, here you have very big park. You have Central Park and everything. In Athens, we have very few parks, like Pedion του Άρεος, actually, which is a place that me and my friends and others in some countercultural assemblies, we are organizing big events there, big festivals and public talks open to the people, free to the people, not made by this, not let's say produced for commercial reasons, but just for the people and to the people. So these assemblies started taking actions. For example, they were occupying one place that it was an abandoned, let's say, a parking area. And they were recreating that parking area into a park, like Navarinou Park in Athens, Exarchia area. That the people of all the neighborhood came, they planted trees, they created spaces, they took out the asphalt, they created spaces of pure ground, they cleaned everything, they built some fantastic pedestrian side spots around, in a very, let's say, with kaleidoscopic colors, with small different type of stones, mosaics.
Mosaics,
right? Yeah, of course.
Mosaics, right.
Yeah.
We have that here, a lot of that.
And it was very beautiful. Yeah. And many things like this took place all over Greece after 2009. And when the Arab Spring adopted many of these ideas in north of Africa and other places, the idea of immediate democracy, the idea of using the social media to connect people for a certain subject against repression, for example, and all that stuff, then this went back after the big economic crisis came finally to Europe in late 2009, early 2010, in Greece first and spread it all over in the south, in Spain and Italy and all that stuff. Replanted this thing in Spain. They have a long tradition in the 30s, before the Spanish Revolution and everything, but this had been stopped after the dictatorship that took 40 years and all that stuff. And now the Spanish took again the advantage and created assemblies. They created the Indignados movement with assemblies based on the direct democracy model. And then this thing, just 1 month after you had millions of people going to Madrid and Barcelona and gathered together in social spaces, you had Aganaktizmenous in Greece, that they were also now using again in a much wider scale that model that had been used in a more communal assembly scale in 2009. Now they were using this for taking decisions, let's say 50,000 people, 60,000 people, 100,000 people. And that was Aganaktizmeni thing. And then, the things went like this.
Well, where do we go from here? Because,
after there was Occupy in the U.S.
Yeah, here in the U.S.
there were things in Turkey, in Istanbul.
A lot of the forces that were behind Occupy went on to support an electoral candidacy of Bernie Sanders, and others seem like they've disappeared. A few stayed on the scene. Some went into the Black Lives Movement. There seems to be a dividing up of the movement and sort of a loss of that kind of focus. Did you have the same problem in Greece, and how are people responding to it there?
Well, there was something like this, but in Greece, let's speak about Greece, yes. In Greece, the things were more, let's say, focused, because after what took place with the brutal, let's say, end of Σύνταγμα Square, αγανακτισμένους thing.
What happened?
We had.
What was the brutal end? What happened?
Well, there was strong repression finally by the government, who wanted to bring forth very strong austerity measures. After the first memorandum in 2010, there was a coalition government between the right and the center.
There's some belief,
Greece.
I've heard, that there's some...
And these people, I mean, they weren't liking having hundreds of thousands of people in squares saying, being peaceful and saying, okay, we don't like these austerity measures, find different ways. This is not a thing that is being created by us. This is a thing that is being created by the elite, the transnational elite inside the European Union. So what is this? I mean, what? So that government, the coalition government, used all the means to destroy the movement, which included police brutality and all that stuff. But the movement lasted for months, for 4 or 5 months, until September. I would say until October 2011, and it was very heavily combined with the same type of movement in Italy and Spain and Portugal.
And the United States. But we had the same thing.
Yeah, in the United States you had also the Occupy thing.
It was told, we were told that there were communications between the repressive forces in all these places in Greece and in Spain and the United States and Portugal in order to coordinate their activities to try, and that's why it all sort of got crushed around the same time.
Well, I would say also that you know, the movements in Europe had been for a longer time. There was an exhaustion after, especially the repression, after also the strengthening of the repression, and also after the heavy pressure that now was evolving because of the government's coalition. Before of that, you had a government of the center, of PASOK and the rest. Now you had a coalition government between the center and the right wings, so a stronger case was
We're
going
heading that
on
way now
here.
with Trump. I mean, you know, it seems that way. With Donald Trump would be, if he's doing very well. I mean, he could be a potentially president of the United States, and you be met now with a madman in charge of the United States with right-wing support.
Yeah, the political system in the United States is it's quite different. You mainly have two big parties, but in Greece or in Europe there are several parties. Sometimes they're making, I mean, parties that equally trying to get
where do we go
the
from
election.
here?
So sometimes there are coalitions and all that stuff. But at the end, after you had a strong repression because there was this coalition government between the strong center and the right wings.
I see.
Yes.
It sounds like Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump here to me. Where do we go from here? I mean, where do you think, you know, as a thinker and writer?
Things going on after that period.
Yeah.
I mean, you had the we had the austerity measures in Greece that had been voted there in the summer of 2011. Afterwards, there was the big second memorandum voted in 2012, February, on 12th of February, where also there were mass demonstrations of the people in Greece. Let's say in Greece there was a demonstration of 1 million people. There were, you know, it was almost like, you know, unsurprising, but these things had been voted by that government. Afterwards, there was a strong current that was bringing forth a small party of the left, which didn't have more than 4% before, and its name was Syriza. and brought finally that party into a level of 30% or 34% on the voting of 2012. Oh. They just lost because of a coalition between the right wings and some center social democrats that used to be members of Syriza in the past. And after the collapse of that government, which was an extreme right-wing government, if you want my opinion, not openly, but some of the people who were very much involved in that government that gratefully, in my opinion, lasted only until January 2015, had connections. Some of these people, not the higher, let's say, people, not the prime minister or the main ministers, but some of them had also connections and affiliations with part of the neo-Nazi group of Golden Dawn, which during the period of that government, Golden Dawn was.
What is Golden Dawn? Explain that to people.
It's a racist, anti-Semitic, neo-Nazi group, a political party, it's so called.
Now we're talking Trump.
Well, no, we speak about Nazis.
I
mean, we
hardcore,
speak about
wearing
Nazis. Okay, they used to wear that, but after they made to enter the parliament, because of the austerity measures, not all the people went towards what is so-called the left. Some other people tried to do in a more autonomous way and an anti-authoritarian, let's say, way from below, creating assemblies and all that stuff. Some other people started voting the extreme right wing, and not just the right wing government. So from
then
this
immigrants, basically, immigration is the problem. It seems to always focus on immigration.
In all Europe, they use the immigration thing. That these people that come in Europe for, let's say, fighting a better life and all that stuff, work and everything. They use the racial thing. They use the immigration thing just to work on the fear of the people, on the fear of the different. They work very much on the notion of having different cultures and different people around you that surrounds you. And this, in some parts of the small bourgeois people, let's say, or the lower parts of the middle class.
Petit bourgeois, we say here.
Petit bourgeois, en français. This creates somehow, let's say, a wave, a flood that votes for this kind of extreme right-wing party. But the Golden Dawn, it's the most extreme right-wing party in Europe. They are not just extreme right-wings in the way that they are in other countries like in Spain or even in Italy. They are, truly speaking, they come from a Nazi background.
Okay.
Their great-grandfathers, I mean, even
were Nazis, were in the SS.
They weren't in SS because we didn't have an SS in Greece. There was a huge resistance against, huge, I mean, hundreds of thousands of people against the occupation by the Nazi army. But some of their grandfathers, let's say, were extreme right-wings who were collaborating with...
I see.
Yes. And these people, the people of the Golden Dawn, had started during the right-wing government, they started attacks on immigrants, a lot of attacks all over Greece in a very organized way, and also attacks on people who were thinking differently, without even having a strong counterattack or any reaction by the authorities. The authorities simply letting them do the stuff. Yes, it was going like this for, let's say, 1.5 years. And unfortunately, at the end, a young rapper, Pavlos Fissas, who was very much on the anti-Nazi thing, had been assassinated by one of these people. Yes, and they couldn't hide that because it happened on public, that people had been arrested, and then all the things came forth because Pavlos Fissas was, we have a case here also. Pavlos Fissas was white, was a kid of, let's say, not of the middle class, something like that. He had ideas that were not the ideas of the majority, but in the same time, he was not an immigrant. He was not somebody who was out of Greece and all that stuff and being there. He was one of us. So nobody could hide such an incident, such a brutal incident. So even the leaders of that Golden Dawn party, even though because it's a democracy, we cannot just split down parties, even of the most extreme ones, the leaders went to jail for a strong period of time.
They were involved. It was discovered they were involved in this assassination of a young rapper who.
They went to jail. Now there is a legal battle.
All right, a couple
there's
minutes.
There's a trial going on.
We're in the last 2 minutes, Giannis. This is fascinating. Where do you see? Do you have any ideas about the future? What happens next?
Syriza came up on power also by votes of people who were not really for the Syriza because they were believing that Syriza is a reformist party. They're just going to work with the establishment, finally, all the stuff. But they thought that it could be a little bit better than what was going on before. So Syriza came up, started to all this endless discussion of the austerity measures and what was going on with the debt. And finally, all the elites of European Union, somehow, they didn't like even the idea of having so-called reformist socialists that they were on power on one state and weren't exactly following the idea of extreme neoliberal prototype that was all over European Union accepted as a Bible. So they forced Syriza to go on the edge, and afterwards we had all the crash, the collapse of last summer that brought Greece on the edge of a complete financial disaster and even a humanitarian disaster. At the end, the Syriza people said, okay, we sign, so somehow they withdraw. The future is not in people of Syriza or all these kind of people. The future come in the mind of the people inside assemblies that they take all the lessons of the past and now they try to organize again and again and connect countercultures all over the planet, cultures that are not just national but also transnational.
Thank you very much.
And in the same time, that's the thing. The thing is creating something new through a counterculture. That's the future.